Okay, well, I welcome you back to yet another Neuroethics Learning Collaborative lecture, again, part of the Regulatory Issues section. Today we have Professor Jon Merz from the Department of Medical Ethics. Jon is going to be talking in this first lecture about ethics of science, misconduct, and conflict of interest. That's what the COI stands for. And in the second lecture on publication and peer review. Let me tell you a little bit about Jon, who has a most interesting and checkered past. I've lost my notes, but I think I can remember this. He started out in life as a nuclear engineering major. Then he went to law school, am I right? No. M.B.A. Oh, I see. They're listed in chronological order. Then he got an M.B.A., after which he went to law school, earned a J.D., did a stint as a patent lawyer, and finally returned to graduate school and got a Ph.D. in, I've forgotten, I'm sorry, Science and Society. Engineering and Public Policy, thank you. After which he spent some time at a think tank, the RAND Institute and Corporation. And then he came to Penn, where he is now an associate professor in the Department of Biomedical Ethics. So thank you so much, Jon, and we'll, without further ado, take it away.
Okay. So I'm not used to the lecture format, unfortunately, but you've been told not to ask questions, so really just try to keep them to the end. So I'm going to talk about, the first thing is ethics in science and misconduct issues and conflicts of interest. So just an overview, I'm going to talk about ethics in science. I think you've already talked about ethics. You already had a philosopher come talk to you. I'm not a philosopher. I'm not going to talk about the ethics as a philosopher, too much of a philosopher, but I figured I would review enough to give you a sense of how it relates to science. And then I'll just talk about misconduct and see what conflicts of interest. So what is ethics? You've already heard about this, right? And ethics, I'm going to determine it in a particular way. Philosophers may not agree with me, and this may not be consonant with what you've already heard, but I like to think of ethics as inquiry that lets us distinguish the good from the bad, right? So, and it stands in contraposition to morals, which are basically, the way I think of them, is expressions of shared values. So like, think about the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments say, these are good things, these are bad things. And for those who subscribe to the Ten Commandments, that's going to be the shared value, set of values that ties them together, okay? In ethics, but especially in sciences, we have a tendency to use these terms interchangeably. Somebody will say something's immoral, somebody's unethical, and it's like, well, where's the difference, right? And basically, I'm going to say that ethics in science and the professions are really assertions of what are good or bad in those fields and disciplines, and I'm not really going to try and draw a firm line between them, all right? So how do we decide what is ethical in any field, really? There's various approaches to ethics. We can think of ethics as normative or prescriptive, and here we're asking the question, what ought to be done? And you can kind of look at a situation and say, well, here's maybe what people really do, but that's not ethical, and what we really should be doing is something else, as opposed to descriptive. And descriptive is merely kind of like studying what is done and saying that's ethical. Various approaches, and you probably already talked about these in some detail. The deontology is duty or rule-based decision-making. Consequentialism is essentially looking at outcomes, like utility theory. And casuistry, which is basically thick case analysis, to kind of the draw from which we can draw generalized rules. Right? So here's an ethical conundrum. Right? It says at the bottom, untying your opponent's shoes is just the latest defensive strategy sweeping the SEC. Now, is this ethical? And I've actually asked the various constituencies this question, and some people say yes, heck yes, this is really ethical. And it's almost like anything, when you say that, you say anything goes. I mean, you could take a look at this and say, well, look, it's not fair play, right? That's a set of rule, that's a rule. You can also say from a consequentialist perspective that this guy is trying to hurt the other person, or is risking hurting that other person for some gain to his own team, right? So in some sense, depending on how you approach this, right, you can say it's okay or it's not okay. Right? It's funny that they got it on camera, though. I don't know if you could see that, but he's untying his shoes. Okay, so who decides? And I'm going to here now kind of make sure that we're focusing on the scientific community. So what is a scientific community? In science, science is a community of those who are skilled in practice, methods accepted by others, as assessed by mentors and peer reviewers. Okay, and we'll be talking about peer review later. But essentially, when you go through training, you are learning the scientific method within your discipline, right? And different disciplines have different methods, right? And sometimes they're very, some disciplines are very highly derogatory of other people's methods. In fact, that leads to sometimes very narrow definitions of your community. Within the community, I mean, we'll have professional societies. In psychology, you have the American Psychological Association. I'm sure there's one in neurology as well. There's psychiatry, there's sociology, there's anthropology. Within medicine, there's a bunch of just specialty organizations, as well as general organizations within medicine, such as the AMA. In law, we have the Bar Association and the like. And within all of these organizations, they have a tendency to promulgate codes of ethics. And they're not the same codes. In fact, if you look at the American Sociological Association's Code of Ethics and you compare it to the American Psychological Association's Code of Ethics, you wind up with different, at the margins, you wind up with different things. Sure, some of the basic things are the same, like be truthful, right? Don't cook data and that kind of stuff. But when it gets down to dealing with human subjects or dealing with animals and everything else, there will be differences. And sometimes you have to say, well, how did they come up with different answers? And they do it because sometimes it's what's convenient or what's necessary for them to do what they do within their disciplines. Right? And psychology is interesting because of deception. I mean, deception research is very important in psychology. We do it all the time. In sociology, we deceive people, but we don't really want to know. We don't want them to know that we're deceiving them necessarily. And this deception may be treated a little bit differently in the other disciplines. Society also has a role to play here, right? And what we've seen over the last 100 years is social regulation of science. Right? It's normally highly reactive to revealed problems in self-regulation. I mean, science is generally, just like medicine or law, is generally accorded a lot of discretion to kind of create its own rules. Right? But every now and then, the scientists violate some real powerful social norms. And they've had laws, basically, usually laws or some kind of regulations enacted that restrict what it is that scientists do. So we've seen this, for instance, in protection of humans and animals. I guess you already had a lecture on animals and humans in research. I don't know how much Autumn reviewed the history of that, but all of the regulations we have were highly reactive, both in the drug world, FDA and all and the like, as well as in the non-drug world, very reactive to revealed bad events. The animals world, exactly the same thing. We had no animal regulations until 1966. For example, until there was a Time magazine, Life magazine, had a picture expose of animals being used in research. And they were essentially animals that had been recovered from pounds. So this was your dog Fifi that had been picked up by, because it ran out of the house. It was picked up, taken to a pound, and suddenly wound up in a research lab. And as a result, numerous states passed laws, and the feds actually passed a law basically saying you can't do that. So another area is scientific integrity. I mean, this is actually tied to funding. The federal government provides, some $30 billion at least in just an NIH kind of money for support of research. And because of that, they want the kind of like responsible use of those governmental monies. They will police, so to speak, the police conduct. Conflicts of interest is a fairly recent phenomenon. It's been kind of on people's radar screens for the last 20 or 30 years. The feds got more and more interested in a lot because of the same reason. It's basically a conflict, as we'll talk about, can undermine the objectivity and the truthfulness of science, and because the feds are putting so much money into it, they're interested in it. The FDA turns out to be leading the charge on this because they're so interested in truth, and because sponsored research plays such a large role in bringing products to market, and there's an inherent conflict of interest there. And finally, one last thing that society does is sometimes it restricts what is called forbidden knowledge, or forbidden science. And here we have things like nuclear technology. Right? You can't possess special nuclear material. Right? It's just forbidden. If you do stuff, in fact, I've heard of people writing dissertations that have then been declared secret, right? And you can't publish them. So. The other areas that we all know about, stem cells and reproductive cloning, for instance. This is an area where the states, the feds, as well as internationally, many states have basically seriously restricted what it is that scientists can do. All right. So in some sense, if you think about scientists, no scientist is an island, right? We're basically, I've kind of like drawn this. You have your scientist is kind of right here, and you got all these C's. And a C is a colleague, is also a competitor, and is also a codependent. And I'll talk about, for the next 2 hours, I'll talk about how we are codependent on each other, kind of playing nice in the sandbox, because if we don't, and you end up with some crazy scientific practices. But the scientist exists within his or her department, within the university, within a school sometimes. There are competitors and codependents and colleagues around us. And they exist in other institutions, the firms, corporate firms, as well as universities. They define fields as well as disciplines, as well as the field of science. I mean, these are all kind of like encompassing. And even within it, all of these, they can exercise elements of control on people. We're also dependent upon people playing nice and doing the things that they're supposed to do to be a good scientist. So, given this, what are the ethics of science? Is there an ethic of science? So Robert Merton in 1942 described he said a generalized norm, but it was really an idealized norm of science. He characterized 4 norms. First was universalism. He says that basically universalism is got to be truthful. The quality of the science has to be judged by scientific standards, right? And scientific standards alone. You shouldn't let politics and other things infuse and weigh in on whether or not science is telling the truth. He wrote about communism, which has been interpreted as communalism due to the weight assigned to the other word. Here he basically said, we're members of that community. We have an obligation to share and communicate with our colleagues and basically provide information to them, that we learn from them, and then we teach them. He said there's disinterestedness. This is right. This is kind of like the objectivity, seeking objectivity. And the primary concern of any scientist has to be the advancement of knowledge, and that alone. Right? And then he talked about organized skepticism, which is that whenever you see something, you see a paper published, you question it. Right? This is our criticism or critique. It's scrutiny, repetition, and validity and validation of stuff before we accept it as something, before it is actually accepted within the scientific community as a truth. Right? This has been built on, it's been critiqued and criticized and like, it still has some value because you think about these norms and they have a lot of value for what it is that science is trying to do. Science is trying to reveal the truth about the world around us, right? I just put down one of the embodiments, a later embodiment of Merton's work was by Conundrum. He extended this, you see the overlapping set here, but he says there's integrity and objectivity. So it's truth-telling and avoiding undisciplined, what he called undisciplined introduction of subjective elements into their observations, which when we talk about conflicts of interest, you can think about that. Tolerance is basically kind of like a good faith effort of making sure that you recognize the good faith efforts of others, and that you're in a common enterprise to reveal the truth. He said the doubt of certitude, and this is the organized skepticism. It's basically a questioning attitude. He said there's got to be recognition of error, duty to recognize and acknowledge and admit error. And we see, so you go to the literature, sometimes people basically try to extend their work. It doesn't work. And they retract their papers. And that's an obligation. If you know that something's false, and you have to ask yourself, what's my obligation to report it and to police it? Especially not only myself, but others. Okay? Unselfish engagement, the primary purpose should be extending knowledge, again, which is this disinterestedness, and a communal spirit, appreciating and respecting the codependence that I talked about earlier. So then we hit the reality, right? And the reality is that there's a lot of pressures in science to produce, right? So here we have a guy sitting there, his boss is telling him behind one door is tenure, behind the other is flipping burgers at McDonald's, right? You either meet the standards or you're out, right? So thinking more concretely, I mean, those are the norms by Conundrum and by Merton were kind of fairly abstract, right? What are the more concrete things that are expected of the good scientists? So I'll say the first one is, and this is probably one of the most important ones, is intellectual integrity and honesty. Basically, you're expected to tell the truth and you have to be trustworthy. People have to be able to trust what it is that you're saying. What you've written in your published work is true. When you say what you did, that is actually what you did, right? Because if you don't do this, then scientists who are going to later try and stand on your shoulders, as they say, are going to be unable to. They're going to fall off, right? And that's a bad thing. Let's talk about collegiality, the idea that you're going to share ideas and data, right? This is a nice idea. People do it, obviously. We work with some people. We also learn who we can't work with, mainly because of the lack of trustworthiness, right? There's a duty to publish and disseminate what we learn, right? And for various reasons. We'll talk about that later. There's a there's a duty to educate, to mentor and train others, right? Which is kind of self-promoting in a way, because if we train other people to do what we do, then it builds up our own reputations and all. Some have argued that there's an obligation to defend the freedom of inquiry and academic freedom. And one writer actually wrote, a name Glass, wrote that it's a duty to defend it to the death. I don't know that I would actually subscribe to that, but okay. There's a duty to give credit where due, right? I mean, science is based on ideas and taking ideas to fruition. But at the same time, we're not going to really talk about intellectual property, but at the same time, people will say no one owns an idea, right? And because it's not really protectable as intellectual property, an unembodied idea. So we can talk about that more. There's a duty, and this is very pragmatic, a duty to perform peer review and refereeing activities within the scientific community. This is an unfunded, I'll talk about again in the next hour, kind of an unfunded mandate that you have to do this, and it can be a real pain in the neck, but nonetheless, it's, if everybody stepped away from it, it wouldn't get done. So we're all codependent. We're codependent upon everybody else doing it and doing it right and doing it fairly. There's a duty to engage in public discourse, and this is another unfunded mandate. You publish a paper, especially nowadays, and we can talk about this in the next hour as well. You put your paper out there. Who's the first person that calls is the science writers for Science magazine, right? And then the Times writers, science writers will call you, and it's like, okay, so you're supposed to take time out of your schedule and talk to these people. The science writers are usually pretty good, but sometimes they're looking for a story. And you have to be able to kind of put up with that. Anyway, there's a duty to comply with the law. If something's legal or illegal, I mean, do you think it's ethical to kind of like say that you're complying with the law? And at what point would you say, I don't have to follow the law? You step away from that. And finally, one question is if you know about somebody who's not playing by these rules, do you have an obligation to blow the whistle? So, here we have a cartoon by Bizarro. He says, TV guy says, statistically speaking, there's an 85% chance that 4 out of 5 statisticians alter their data by at least 26%. And the guy says, I don't like those odds. Okay. What's interesting is that he has a heart on his wall in the back. See the heart? Okay. So are ethics enforced? So we have these nice kind of like these ideas and norms and like. And how are they enforced and how? Okay, so it turns out that misconduct, which I'm going to talk about and define for you, is directed to these wrongs, those wrongs of this entire list that undermine the veracity of the scientific record. Right? You can talk about all the other things, but really they don't really get at the core of what it is that scientists do. The two that do is basically the obligation to tell the truth, right? Don't cook your data and the like, and the duty to give credit where due. Make sure that you're appropriately referencing somebody. Don't steal the work of others. Right? That's plagiarism. And these others are enforced, but they're more informal sanctions. So people get reputations as not being trustworthy, particularly, and doing kind of crazy things, even stealing, because sometimes like stealing ideas, for instance. An idea is not really protectable because it's not embodied in any way that you can say, oh, well, it's protected. So if you get up at a meeting and say, what about doing X, and X is not already written, published someplace, then somebody who's there can take it, basically. So over time, if you talk to scientists in your field, you'll find that scientists learn who they can trust, and they basically watch what they go to scientific meetings, they watch what they say, and they watch what they say to what people, right? And it's really a sad reality, but that's the way it is. Anyway. So the guy standing at the board, and there's all these little ethics discussions here, and he says, I have to fake my data with all these ethics seminars. I don't have time to do experiments. Well, the kid says, really, someone told me it's not plagiarism if they're dead. It is. Okay. So what is misconduct? So typically, like I said, it's basically the two things where you're undermining these core values of science. And this has been basically embodied by the federal government, again, because the federal government provides so much money for the paying for research. They've stepped in and defined, since the 70s, actually 80s, misconduct. Their definition is basically falsification, fabrication, and plagiarism in the performance reporting proposing of research, right? Falsification and fabrication are kind of like different things a little bit, but fabrication is where you just make up data. Falsifying data is where you manipulate your data, you do something and you're not honest about what it is that you did to your data. Plagiarism is taking credit for something that's not yours, right? So the federal standard, and it's worth commenting about, is before 2005, the federal standard included a catch-all phrase that said, and other practices that seriously deviate from those commonly accepted in the scientific community, right? So if you arguably, if you did something else that really kind of like violated these norms of the scientific community, you could be charged with misconduct, right? And there was a paper, a fairly influential little paper written in Science some years ago, again, Shackman, who's basically said, well, and he actually pointed to a case where a professor had slept with some graduate students, committed harassment, was criminally answerable under state law for harassment, and his institution convicted him of misconduct, scientific misconduct. And that's an abuse of misconduct. I mean, it's not within this purview of the scientific community to say whether that's right or wrong. Right? It was illegal, and maybe there's a duty to not to do that. But really, do scientists have any particular cachet or particular skill at determining that that is wrong or not? Probably not. I mean, society does, but science doesn't. On the other hand, when you think about falsification, fabrication, and plagiarism, this is clearly something for scientists to weigh in on, right? Now anyway, so what happened is, in response to concerns about this catch-all, the feds changed their standard, and if you read the standard, it essentially says it's falsification, fabrication, or plagiarism, as well as, it also has to be established that it's also a significant departure from accepted practices. So now the federal standard is that it's FFP, only FFP that's a significant departure from other accepted practices. So if there's some level within your discipline of kind of like falsifying data that's acceptable, then you haven't committed FFP. And I actually wrote an editorial some years ago saying that this was basically an attempt by the feds to get out of the business of policing this. And we also argued that institutions which are primarily responsible for policing misconduct should not adopt the federal standard, because it's basically, it's this impossible. In fact, every time you accuse somebody of FFP, all you have to do is assert that, well, this is an accepted practice, right? And then you get into a kind of evidentiary battle over whether or not it's truly accepted or not. And it turns out that there have been surveys, and I can talk about these, I will talk about these, there have been surveys done that, you know, that various kind of crazy practices are practiced and are admitted to by a respectable minority in some cases, and sometimes a kind of a shady minority of different scientists. So here we have, and this gets to the proposing, so this could be misconduct. It's not our job to ask why we got a grant to research why it crossed the road. It's our job to pretend we're earning it. Sorry about the quality of that. So enforcement, what happens? So I mentioned academic and other institutions have primary responsibility for policing misconduct. The feds do have an office. It's the Office of Research Integrity within Health and Human Services. Will investigate and add sanctions if and only if the research is federally funded. Right? The sanctions here that they can levy are fairly limited. They typically include exclusion from federal grants, advisory roles, peer review. Usually it's for 2 to 3 years. The range is essentially 1 year to 10 years. 10 years was reserved for a single investigator who was a site investigator in Montreal on a major trial that was done in I believe in the late 80s, looking at the relative efficacy of mastectomy versus lumpectomy in breast cancer. And this guy admitted 109 women who did not meet entry criteria. As a result of his kind of like, he was the largest out of, I think there were more than 20 clinical sites for this clinical trial. He was the largest enroller. And when you're thinking about conflicts of interest, he who enrolls the most subjects gets higher authorship order. Right? So he was the second author on lots of the papers because of his high enrollment. Anyway, it was discovered, and he was sanctioned. He actually retired. FDA may also sanction investigators by pulling their license to perform studies that may be submitted to the agency. And this we actually saw with Jim Wilson here with the Gelsinger case. For the FDA, this isn't limited to misconduct. It may also result from the violation of human subjects and animal regulations. Okay, so what do we know really about misconduct? Recent surveys show that fabrication and falsification and fabrication is admitted by less than 1%. And this is a study by Martinson and his colleagues. And observed, so the second study was done by Titus, who actually works for ORI, the Office for Research Integrity. And so the first study, Martinson went out to 3,200 people and basically said, have you ever done this, right? And I'll talk about his data sporadically here. And less than one, like 0.5% of people actually say they've falsified data. Right? The reported is a more difficult one because you want to do, if you're asking people have they observed falsification or fabrication, then you have to control for multiple observations of the same event. So what Titus did is she surveyed federally funded researchers at institutions and sampled on departments. So she only chose one respondent for each department, thinking that these would be fairly limited within departments, so the likelihood of getting multiple reports within an institution of a single case in somebody else's department would be unlikely. So maybe the number happens to be perhaps someplace between those. There is no data on enforcement activity by research institutions. Right? The research institutions, a lot of the stuff is handled locally. In a lot of cases, for instance, I had a colleague some years ago who had hired a research coordinator who was supposed to be going to the courthouse to get jurors to fill out surveys. And it turned out they were giving out candy bars and you fill out a survey. And he detected it. It turned out that the guy was basically sitting at home, eating the candy bars and filling out surveys. And he detected it because he had another person who was doing data entry, and she observed that these looked like they were the same pen and the same style handwriting. So when confronted, this kid, who was actually a graduate student in English at this university, was fired. Summarily, he admitted it, he was summarily fired. So it never made the light of day. It was probably never published because that was one study he was working on. And that was the end of it. And it was always an interesting question whether or not he should have, he's in the academy, was firing him adequate? Right? I mean, should he have gone after him academically as well? We could come up with different answers to that question. And this happens fairly frequently. It happens at fairly high levels as well. I've known cases that have gone all the way to department chairs where they've just kind of like let people know that they've really crossed the lines and they're just pushed out quietly. So even when they're made, even when institutions do have these misconduct panels and the like, it's not necessarily published. So actually getting good data on this and how frequently this happens, we just don't know. We do know that the ORI, the Office for Research Integrity, disposes of several dozen cases per year. And those who are convicted by ORI of falsification or fabrication typically leave academia. And if they have a profession such as psychology or medicine or something like that, they'll go off and practice those professions. Those guilty, what we found, I did a survey a couple of years ago published in Science, those found guilty of plagiarism were significantly more likely to survive in the academy, which is an interesting result. Okay. Unfortunately, there's no systematic way to discover misconduct. Audit, which is typical in FDA research, is not universal. It's expensive. Who's going to perform it and what right to the data they have? So what we wind up doing is relying on peer review, which we won't talk about in too much detail, but peer review is notoriously bad at detecting fraud. If somebody is searching, it's because when somebody submits a manuscript, unless there's something glaring that says this can't be, right, you're never going to look behind it. The peer review is just bad at detecting fraud. We wind up really relying on whistleblowers. Whistleblowers, somebody who just, there's something wrong here. There was a case a couple years ago at Wisconsin, and these graduate students came forward and said, this guy's cooking data. There's another case in Vermont where essentially colleagues and graduate students came forward and said, something's amiss here. Right? In both cases, the miscreants were convicted. In fact, in one case, the guy went to jail, which we can talk about. And then finally, surprising results may raise flags. But this, how often does a really truly surprising result? Does somebody really kind of like stick their neck out? In fact, I mentioned the case at Vermont. He basically did Me Too research. He kept his lab funded. He had a lot of pressure to fund his lab. He just did Me Too research and never really kind of like pushed the limits. Right? It was essentially research that everybody expected the results. It wasn't surprising. On the other hand, we have Bezwoda and Schoen. So Bezwoda was a South African clinician who published, he actually came to a national cancer meeting here in the United States and said he had done a clinical trial looking at high-dose chemotherapy in metastatic breast cancer, and lo and behold, he had survival benefit, right? Now this was in contraposition to 3 big US studies. So the NIH dispatched a bunch of US researchers to go down and audit his study, right? And if he hadn't really stuck his neck out and kind of said something that was so inconsistent with what everybody else had found, they really would have never suspected anything. If he just said, yeah, my results were negative too, he could have gotten published someplace really good, but he didn't do that. They went down, he had totally cooked the data, he went to jail. Schoen was an interesting case, because Schoen was a scientist, maybe some of you guys remember this guy. He was the researcher back in the early 2000s, 2002, 2004, at Bell Labs. Anybody ring a bell with anybody? A physicist? So he was a physicist working in, I don't know, I forget what kind of physics, but he wound up working across a couple of different fields. And his modus, there was just a book published on this, it's pretty good, but it basically says modus operandi was to talk to scientists who actually knew what they were doing and get them to anticipate where the science was going, and then he would just cook data to kind of like meet those expectations. So for those scientists who really thought that's where the field was going, this was really cutting edge stuff. It was doing exactly what they anticipated where the science was going. It was really cool. He published something like 18 papers over a 2 or 3 year period, 18 papers in Science and Nature and like all these physics review letters, and it was like, he was like Nobel bound, right? A couple people within the scientific community were like, this can't be, right? His methods, they tried to duplicate his methods and they tried to extend his work, and it was like, he can't be getting those results. Even as a manager, but his managers at Bell Labs, for various reasons, maybe weren't really paying that much scrutiny to his work, which was unlike Bell Labs at the time, or in the past. Anyway, they let him get away with it, and finally a peer reviewer for a submission, and she took a plot that he had generated for this new paper, and she overlaid a published paper. And they were exact, and there was no reason in nature and nature's world that they should have even been related, much less exact duplicates. So they sent it back to Bell Labs. Bell Labs opened an inquiry. They wound up retracting, I believe, 13 or 14 of his papers. And strangely enough, he had gotten his Ph.D. at a German university. And they took the unprecedented step, I think, of pulling his Ph.D. Interestingly, there was no evidence that he committed fraud in his Ph.D., but they did it on good principles. It's really strange. So he's gone. He's slapping the German equivalent of hamburgers right now. Then there's the Hwang. Everybody probably heard of Hwang. Hwang was the South Korean physicist who basically published a paper in Science saying that he had kind of like made this breakthrough towards human cloning. As a result, I mean, he was charged. I don't know if he didn't ever go to jail, but I think he was close, because he was a fairly good scientist. He actually did clone a dog, Snuppy, right? But he had arguably violated human subjects regulations and kind of ethics issues with the humans, but he clearly committed falsification. As a result, Science now has a policy where they reserve the right, and they will audit a random sample of submitted papers every year. In the past, journals have always reserved this right. They have reserved a right to see the data and put their hands on the data. They've never exercised it. So this is kind of a unique change. And it's not easy to implement, because getting into somebody else's data is not easy to do. Right? All right, so it's worth talking about whistleblowing, because whistleblowing is a phenomenon. And one question you always have to ask, is there a duty to whistleblow? I raised this earlier. Yeah. Interestingly, there are no science ethics codes of which I know that impose a duty to blow the whistle. This stands in contraposition to engineers. Engineers have this clear obligation to protect the public. And what engineers do and scientists do is fundamentally different, I guess, in some way. But engineering codes all say if you see something that's dangerous to the public, you have an obligation to blow the whistle. Right? And one ORI study, so the Office of Research Integrity, again, a study showed that 29% of institutional misconduct policies explicitly require employees to blow the whistle or report it. But at the same time, an RTI study has found that 2 out of 3 whistleblowers reported at least 1 negative consequence. So we have a tendency to shoot the whistleblowers. And anytime somebody says they're thinking about blowing the whistle, they think there's something wrong, you really have to say, what's the downside? How sure are you? I had a student come to me some years ago who worked for a pharmaceutical company, and she said, I have data, and I've been actually taking stuff home every night, and It's like, well, how sure are you that the documents that you've collected really are revelations of this misconduct that you suspect? And are you willing to put your reputation, are you willing to put your future employability in the pharmaceutical industry on the line? It happens, and it's sometimes worth it. Actually, she wind up going to law school, but a colleague of hers in law school blew the whistle on shearing. He was in a unit of shearing that was involved basically in price fixing on Claritin. And from 1996 to 2000, really 2000 or 2001, he documented what was really the practice that was going on, with collusion between the pharmaceutical companies that led to, I think, 11 price increases in Claritin. Now, Claritin is it's not a generic, but there's purely competitive drugs. 10 minutes already? Wow, we're really going slow. Okay, so there's really competitive drugs, and there's no reason, especially in an oligopoly like that those prices should be going up. And anyways, he blew the whistle. The feds wound up settling after George Bush became president. They said make the case go away. Now, if you think about the sale of Claritin over that period of time, 5-year period, it was about $23 billion in sales of Claritin alone. Bush settled for $340 million, which was essentially a 1% to 2% slap in the hands for price fixing of the American public. Anyway, he and his two colleagues walked away with 10%. So they split $35 million, essentially. So he will never work in the pharmaceutical industry again. But, okay. So what is it about whistleblowing? Whistleblowing presents a conflict between one's obligations of loyalty to one's colleagues and institution and those owed to a higher authority, such as the public, right? Be it science or society. It inherently evokes distrust. When somebody's like a whistleblower, it's like, well, what is it about them, right? And Cicely Bach wrote about this, and she said, it's the disappointed, the incompetent, the malicious, and the paranoid, publicity-hungry cranks who tend to blow whistles in public. And unfortunately, that's our perception of people, so it's a disincentive for people to do it. And when people do blow the whistle, there's a very strong need to protect the rights of both parties. You have to protect the accused as well as the whistleblower. And unfortunately, we are not good at protecting the whistleblower. Okay, in the next 10 minutes, I want to talk about conflicts of interest. So here we have a guy who says, my fees are quite high, and yet you say you have little money. I think I'm seeing a conflict of interest here. It's not the kind of conflict of interest we're going to be talking about. So what is a conflict of interest? It's a situation, in very easily definition, it's situations in which an individual owes a duty or obligation to two or more masters. Okay. Now, some people have defined potential conflict of interest, right? And there's two ways of approaching this. One, because it's a natural tendency to say, well, it's a potential conflict of interest. What are we going to do about it, right? And Kasser and Engel said that this caveat appears often to be used in order to appeal delicate and non-judgmental. And it's true. And when you say that you're in a conflict of interest, it's almost a personal insight. Prove that you're not conflicted, right? Porter, another writer, has basically been much more clear and coherent about this. And what he wrote is that a potential conflict of interest is the situation in which one has two or more masters, but those interests are aligned, right? So think about a drug company-sponsored clinical trialist, right? From a scientific perspective, the scientist wants to do good science. As a physician, they want to help patients. And from the sponsor's point of view, they want good data. They want to help patients. They want a drug out at the end of the day. Everybody wants the right results. So where's the conflict? Where's the problem? The problem is that the investigators may want to make the sponsor happy. The sponsor sometimes will want to suppress bad results. I think the Merck case with Vioxx is a good example. The papers that were published on Vioxx, you know what Vioxx caused? It caused heart attacks in the population, right? The original trials that were published, there was an increase for people who got Vioxx. There was an increase in MIs, myocardial infarcts. The data, the public paper that was published in JAMA actually revealed that it was like 19 in one arm versus 7 in the other arm. I may be wrong by 1 or 2 on my numbers, but it wasn't analyzed. And that shows peer review's problem as well. So in some sense, it was a conflict of interest because whoever was writing that up, right, be it probably a drug company, writers, they didn't analyze, maybe their statisticians analyzed it, I don't know if they did or not, but they didn't put it in the manuscript. It's in the paper, but nobody analyzed it. And the peer reviewers, as far as we know, the peer reviewers didn't call it out and say, you have to analyze this. Like, this is a significant difference. Why aren't you talking about that? So the fundamental question about conflicts, and maybe when you see a talk by your colleague in a couple of weeks, is who bears the burden of proof about whether or not a conflict is a matter of concern or not? So the question is whether or not it's the situation itself that presents. You have two masters, you're in a conflicted situation, do something about it. Or as opposed to, and sometimes when people talk about using thresholds, like monetary thresholds to address conflicts of interest, it's proved to us, that an interest less than this is actually a conflict of interest. So some people will use the word potential to say, well, it's maybe a conflict, but the amount of money isn't enough. Right? And I'm basically here to tell you that the amount of money doesn't matter. It's the situation itself. The doctor says, try this, I just bought 100 shares. This is funny, I mean, especially in neurology and in psychiatry, actually. Most recently, there have been two big revelations of psychiatrists who kind of work for the drug companies with the little drug research and stuff. Each one of them, a guy at Harvard and a guy at Emory, were clearing well over $1 million over a couple-year period, I think, from these drug companies. And so, the drug companies don't waste them, they don't give away their money, right? They know that they're getting something back for this. Anyway. So the concern about conflicts is not only that competing interests may distort one's work, so it's not that you're going to necessarily knowingly distort your work, but it risks bias, right? In the interpretation of your data. I mean, dispassionate questioning. Remember Merton, it's like, are you going to be dispassionate about this? Are you going to look deeply enough or not? What are your expectations? Can that be guided or swayed by what your potential gain is from this, et cetera? And you can read those. And then you also have to say, well, there's lots of sources of conflicts of interest, right? One of the big ones in medicine, at least, is the dual hats. We have research and clinical roles, and how do you weigh those? In some sense, the research role almost always conflicts with the clinical role, and wearing those two hats and being coherent about it is very, very difficult. For instance, we have clinicians who want to cure disease. This came up in the Gelsinger case with Mark Batshaw. He treats babies with OTC deficiency. I don't know if you guys know that case. We can talk about it if you have questions. Reputation, people want to put out hot research because they get reputational and they get higher salaries, et cetera, et cetera. We have to publish our research or we perish. Right? And finally, there's money. And we get consultancies, and this little list here is the doctor says, the pharma rep says, take 2 and call me in the morning, and he's got reimbursements, consultancies, meals, honoraria, travel, and the doctors, and the comment here is, did he mention how they're habit forming? So why is all this focus on the money? Because whenever anybody talks about conflicts of interest, we have a tendency to think money, right? Why is this focus on the money? Arguably because direct financial gain from our research is not an inchoate part of doing science, right? People get established corporations on the side to commercialize their inventions. They have all these consultancies and the like, which in some ways can be good because you wind up you learn from those experiences, but you're also being used by those firms for a purpose. And a lot of the times, especially with consultancies and the like, it's an outreach. It's using you as a thought leader to kind of outreach to your colleagues and the like. All right, now here's where I'm going to talk about the money amount. So what are the bases for the concerns about money? First is the obligation of reciprocity. And Cialdini, for you psychology majors, Cialdini did some work a long time ago in 1993. He wrote a book. It basically says this obligation of reciprocity is an extremely powerful motivator for people. And it imposes extremely strong obligations to make, when somebody gives you something, you have an obligation to give back. We have various words that we use, such as Welsher, or I forget the other words, but Welsher's a good one. Right? If you basically gave something to somebody and you're not getting back for it, you're violating the social norm. Right? George Lowenstein, a psychologist at Carnegie Mellon, wrote about the self-interest bias, which is an extremely robust bias. It's fired off by very small emoluments of very small value. It basically alters our perceptions and interpretations, and can also bias decisions. Right? And the thing I think it's important here is that it can alter our decisions, but it also just changes the way we view things. Right? We put it into our own kind of like point of view, and it will actually alter, it biases our decisions and choices and values. And finally, worth mentioning, and you guys probably can talk about this better than I, is there's recent work coming out in using functional MRI. So we know that there's areas that kind of light up, right? There's like reward. We get rewards out of things, and we know that like getting a gift or something, getting those kinds of feedbacks set off those rewards, so it feels good to get something like that. And that's exactly what pharmaceutical reps are giving us, right? So the money, the fact that you're getting something of value, even a very little value, is going to make us feel good, right? So this all suggests, I think, that the value thresholds are probably ineffective. All right, so what do we do about conflicts of interest? Right. Typically, the regulations, unfortunately for the drug regs set conflict of limits for the most part. So one thing we could do is this: look, if it's a severe conflict of interest, we just basically say you have to avoid that situation. Okay, so we don't enter into or we defease ourselves of conflicted situations. For instance, we can have selling equity in commercial entities that have vested interests in particular research results. There's typical use, not necessarily in research, but in other situations of use of blinded trusts. You guys may remember the good senator from Tennessee whose parents owned, what is his name? Bill Frist. He had a blinded trust that his family, I guess, owned one of the HCA, one of the largest HMOs in the country, and he dumped his stuff into a blinded trust. Interestingly, just before the stock took a hit, he sold off 10% or something like that. So whether or not blinded trusts are real or not, and how much oversight of them is an open question. Journal policies have been set that may limit what authors can contribute. I mean, journals nowadays require you to kind of like disclose conflicts. What they consider to be conflicts will vary from journal to journal. And what they do about it. So the New England Journal back in the 90s, the New England Journal had set a policy that said if you have these kinds of conflicts, you cannot do a review article. Right? Turns out that the most well-established clinicians in various fields are the ones who are sought out by pharma and have those conflicted interests, and they're the ones who are most able to write the reviews. So then the New England Journal got kind of hung by its own petard because it basically allowed some things to get through, and it wasn't clear if it was editorial decisions and somebody was asleep at the wheel, so they got in trouble for their own policies. And then the FDA has a whole regulation about this, and the biggest one, of course, is that it restricts roles of advisors with significant conflicts of interest, which is essentially tied to the value of the stock, right? $50,000 in equity or 5% controlling interest in a company or something like that. The other thing, and this is the bigger thing, and this is a kind of a crazy response, is we require disclosure, right? So we require disclosure to the FDA, to the NIH, editors, peer reviewers, meeting attendees. When you go to give a talk, you're supposed to put it up there. If you do a paper poster, you should put it if you have conflicts on there. Journal readers, arguably, editors, when you disclose to an editor, the editors have the discretion to disclose it to readers or not, even to peer reviewers or not, right? Which is kind of weird. To the human subjects, if you have a consent form, you should put something in there in the consent form. And the public, okay? And I'll show you something on that in a minute. What are the effects of disclosure? I mean, you guys are all psychologists and have psychology backgrounds. If you're told somebody has a conflict of interest, what do you do with it, right? It doesn't avoid the underlying problem of bias, right? And which may be impossible to detect, right? It does presume that different recipients of the information will know how to assess the potential biases and respond to them. Now, there's a very interesting study that Lowenstein and his colleague did. It was published in 2005 in Journal Legal Studies that showed that disclosure, so you set up people in kind of a mock, I'm going to give you financial advice about making an investment, and you can respond to it or not. And then basically set some people up in a condition with conflicts of interest. Disclosure or not, I think it was 4 arms. It showed that disclosure paradoxically led to more biased advice. So once you reveal to your client that you have a conflict of interest, you can actually be more biased about it, right? Because you have carte blanche, they know, right? People responded, the recipients of the information responded to the conflict, but not enough to offset the bias. Okay, so here we have, unfortunately, assertions of, as I mentioned earlier, assertions of conflicts of interest often lead to ad hominem attacks on the individual. You're conflicted, you can't do this, you're not trustworthy. And part of the problem is that we have to trust people, and some of science is fairly subjective, and if we don't trust exactly what they're saying, then there's maybe enough wiggle room at the margins that we don't know what to do. So, and I just want to disclose anything, but there is a trend in universities, and you'll probably all face this someday, of public disclosure. So this is not showing up because there's a, let me hold on a second. How come I can't do this? How do I do this? Anybody know how to do this? Oh wait, hit the green. Wait. Okay, there. So this is Penn Medicine, little public disclosure of conflicts of interest. So you can search for somebody, and I'll search for me. I don't want to out anybody else. And this started last year, and there I am. And every year, it will put up what we've done in the past year. And it just literally says what the range is. The ranges are fairly large. It's like less than 1,000, 1,000 to 10,000. I think it's 10,000 to 100,000 or more than 100,000. So it's these like large ranges. And everything goes in there. Right? And these are all public. Anybody can go to these websites and kind of look at it. And what are they supposed to do with this? Right? And who knows? But anyway, I'll stop there.